Welcome to Life with Beth and Court,
where we teach you how to live authentically and build your best life,
one step at a time. Welcome back to another episode of Life with Beth and Court. I'm Beth.
I'm Court.
And today we're talking about how to navigate emotional shirtstorms. I was going to just ask, does anyone know where shirtstorms come from? But you can't answer back. I mean, you can, but we're not live with you there, so couldn't tell if you were saying the right answer or not.
But we're proud of you if you get the right answer.
So it's from, the term shirtstorm is from a Netflix original show called The Good Place.
Nope, it's on NBC.
All right. The Good Place is a TV show starring Kristen Bell and Ted Danson. And Kristen Bell, the premise of the show, without ruining anything. Am I ruining?
Ooh.
I don't know. I should have just read the synopsis offline.
Well,
but
they can do that.
Basically, Kristen Bell ends up in the good place by accident, and she believes that she should be in the bad place. And her character is a bit uncouth, shall we say, and she swears a lot on Earth, or did. And in the good place, though, you're not allowed to swear, and by not allowed, it literally just autocorrects your words. So whenever she tries to swear, it comes out as "what a bench," or
"what the fork,"
"what the fork," or "what an emotional shirtstorm." So anyway, we decided to make this a bit more kid-friendly and call it the navigating the emotional shirtstorms of life. So that's where the term comes from. It's kind of odd. I get it, but it's funny.
So we named the title of this episode after a funny play on words from a show we like. But in all actuality, when we're talking about emotions, it can be really intense and painful and overwhelming. And I think when you hear the word emotions or emotional, it has a negative connotation associated with it. Like, I feel like if we were to say, what is one word you think of when you hear emotions? I mean, I think there'd be a lot of like, ugh, no, bad.
I physically put my hands in my armpits.
You do. That is what you do when
like
you have
superstar.
To talk about emotions. So when you think about that, it can be really heavy and intense, and you're applying that to living everyday life with emotions, it's really easy to feel stuck or overwhelmed or not being sure how to navigate them. And while we're in a good place now where we feel like we have an emotional middle ground because we've done a lot of work and we have had to have a growth mindset, it wasn't always that way. Like, if we want to take a little stroll down memory lane to 4 years ago, we processed emotions very differently, and I'm not sure they were healthy exactly.
I dented my car with my bare hand. I would go ahead and say that they weren't. It was not healthy how I processed emotions.
Why don't you share a little bit of your background of where you were at with handling emotions when we met?
Emotions made me very uncomfortable, but it didn't mean that I didn't have them. I just refused to acknowledge them. And by refuse to, it was more of a subconscious inability to identify emotions because I couldn't tell what was making me feel what. All I knew is when suddenly I was angry. And then in that moment of anger, I was trying to sort through why I was even, it would be something small that would set me off that had a disproportionate reaction from me. And then I had to like unwind all the emotional bullshit that led to that moment. So for me, I had a very hard time identifying what my emotions even were. And once I knew what they were, I didn't really know how to process them after that and what to do with those emotions. And so for me, it ended up turning into anger most times. And when we had conversations, you would be like, why wouldn't you just say some of these things that were upsetting you along the way? And I'd be like, I didn't even know I felt it until I just said it out loud. So I was pretty good at collecting emotions like little fireflies in a little mason jar until that mason jar was way too full and it was an actual lightning storm.
Yeah. And then so you were more internal. So you would kind of just keep it to yourself when you were feeling emotions. And two, when it got to that point that they had been suppressed for so long and the last thing tipped it over the edge, then everything came out really emotionally charged. And usually for you, it was anger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because anger for me was the only comfortable emotion.
Yeah. So looking at how you handled your emotions, for me, I would say up until about a year ago, I handled them very differently, but they also were unmanageable and maybe not the healthiest for myself. And so for me, the biggest things I can think of is I would lash out and get defensive when I thought anyone was hurting me or about to hurt me. I cried a lot, like all the time. I gave ultimatums. I would pick fights just to engage in that person's energy. I would take everything personal. I was jealous. I was judgmental. And finally, so even just hearing all of those things out loud, super overwhelming. Super overwhelming.
But it also takes a lot of courage to admit those things out loud. I think there's a lot of people who are stuck in feeling shame around those things. And if you feel shame around a behavior and you try to push it away, deny it, keep it secret, whatever, that's where shame lives the strongest. And so I think by shedding light on saying, even if you're not out of the shirt storm yet, even if those are still behaviors that you engage in, I think there's power in saying, I'm identifying that this is a problem because I do give ultimatums, I am judgmental, I cry all the time, and I have way bigger reactions than the situation warrants.
Right. And I think that, so all of those things were evident, and I really, really wanted to grow and be a better person. And I had to find the commonality. I was like, what are the commonalities in all of these things? And it was that I was reacting out of emotion. I could trace every one of those things I just listed back to being emotional. And I think when people hear emotional, they think that it's always crying. But we talked about that in an episode before. It can be anger, it can be loneliness, it can be grief. Like, emotion is such a wide umbrella. So I was already on track understanding that there was this commonality between those things. But for me, it took a breakthrough situation for me to say, okay, my emotions are out of control and they are controlling my life, essentially. The inciting incident was a story that I told myself that I allowed my brain to run away with. And then I let my emotions get involved, which created this cycle of anxiety. And I remember feeling paralyzed in my own emotion for an entire weekend over one thing that didn't actually happen that I made up in my head. And I was exhausted. I did not sleep. I did not eat. I cried all weekend over something that did not actually happen. And it was after that weekend, I was like, this has to be done. I cannot continue to let my life be run by my emotions. And if this is how it feels, which it felt horrible, then I certainly don't want that. This is not what I want my life to be.
Well, and when you talk about having your life run by your emotions, quite literally, if you look at the science of it, our emotions hijack our amygdala in our brain, and we start making decisions with our emotional brain or our caveman brain.
And there's another piece of biochemistry involved that we'll talk about later when we talk about tips and tricks to help yourself get through these emotional phases. So don't dismiss the biochemical element of this, because there's a lot of it involved. And in a way, once you realize that, it makes you feel way less crazy.
Well, and it should help you give yourself a bit more grace to understand that you're not just flying off the handle. Your brain and decision making is hijacked by those emotions. And so once you've come to realize that, A, give yourself a bit of grace, that you're literally trying to fight your biology. And secondly, it helps you understand, if you understand the cause and you understand what's happening and why your brain is hijacked and making decisions from an emotional state, it helps you understand what the antidote to that is and how to calm your brain down and start making decisions from the logical frontal lobe.
The first part of this process is, how do you identify when you're in an emotional shirtstorm? So for me, there was this inciting incident. A little bit before that, I started to realize like all of these patterns were rooted in being emotionally charged. But truthfully, for me, that's how it went. But sometimes it doesn't always work that way, because when you look at your circumstances in life, your work, your family, your relationship with yourself and your self-care routine, your friendships, all of those things, there can be emotional stressors all over the place. So some of you might be like, well, how do I know if this is normal? Like, how do I know what normal is? And
Neurotypical.
yes, I hate using normal. I shouldn't have said that. But how do I get an idea of if I'm in the middle of an emotional shirt storm or if I'm living a lifestyle of an emotional shirt storm, where that difference is?
And I think one of the most important parts of making sure that you're not living a lifestyle of emotional shirt storms is getting out of the victim mentality. I'm not in control because this happened, therefore it made me act like this.
Right.
That's not true at all. We always have control over our behaviors. We can't control what happens to us. We control how we respond to those things. And when you look at things that are happening, when you're in the victim mindset, you could easily look back at all those behaviors that you just listed and say, no, it wasn't my fault.
Yeah.
It's not my fault.
Oh, I was a blamer.
Yeah.
It was everyone else's fault.
Exactly. And that's the thing is if you can't get out of blaming someone else for the emotions that you feel, and I've been there too. Like I think one of the biggest examples is when I was in college and I had a terrible experience with my coach. I mean, you're responsible for your behaviors. And so I think grace is important, but also accountability and taking responsibility for your actions and behaviors and thoughts around when you feel emotions and what you actually have control over.
Yeah. And I think another thing that would be an identifier to figure out where you're at with your emotions, I would encourage you to think of a time when you were your best self. If you know you're not your best self right now and there's a lot going on, go back to the last point you can remember. It's kind of like a save point in a video game. Like go back to your last save point and take a snapshot of who you were in that moment. So I knew at some point in my life, I was compassionate, I was caring, I was giving, I was patient. Patient was a huge red flag for me to know I was in an emotional shirt storm. Go back and see what that looked like for you and say, this is what it looked like. And if you don't feel like you've hit that point in your life yet, that's okay. But write down what it looks like to be your best self and then put it side by side with where you're at now. And that will give you a very good indication of, ooh, I'm like way off base with where I want to be. And I am in an emotional shirt storm. And I think that's another good way to identify it. And there also are temporary shirt storms, right? So there's a lifestyle of it, like you just said. And then there's also, you know, if something happens, if there's grief, if there's loss, or, you know, in our last podcast episode talking about boundaries, we talked about sometimes when you enforce boundaries, there's emotional warfare at the table. And it's not that it didn't need to happen, but you know that there's going to be an emotional shirt storm on the other side.
Yeah, and I think that we've had people in our lives who reach out and say, hey, I'm feeling a lot of anxiety right now. I just need to talk through it. And I think anxiety is a huge form of being an emotional shirt storm because anxiety in particular will completely hijack our bodies because you know that feeling when it's that pit in your stomach is churning, your armpit starts sweating, your heart starts racing. Sometimes it can even feel like we're hyperventilating. It can feel like it can turn into a full-blown panic attack. And that's a really good example of how emotions are hijacking our physical body. And so it's important that once you identify it, you know the next steps in order to come out of that so that you don't end up hurting others in your life or you don't end up hurting yourself emotionally or physically. So when you're in the midst of having an emotional attack, I guess I would call it, how do you come out of it in that moment?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think truthfully, it just depends on who it is, because everyone's going to react differently. How you reacted with anger, I reacted with crying. And so really it's looking at what's happening and how to give yourself the appropriate self-talk to get where you need to go. So I think the first thing that's important is to identify that this is normal. Everyone has emotions, and even though it feels super intense and super out of control, give yourself some self-compassion and say, okay, I am going through something emotional right now. It's totally normal to be feeling this. And if you can trace in the moment where the emotion is coming from, that's even better. What I mean by that is if you can figure out what triggered that emotion. So for example, if I almost get in a car accident at an intersection, and I'm fine. I get through the intersection and I pull over and I'm shaking and I'm crying. I could tell myself, oh my gosh, you're fine. Get over it. Like, you didn't get hit. You're fine. Deal with it. But the reality is, maybe I was almost in a car accident before. Maybe I had a parent that died in a car accident. So given situations that built my past reaction to that moment, that is where you have to give yourself self-compassion. Say, of course. And even if there isn't an incident that ties back, like, that's really scary. So having compassion to say, of course you're upset. You almost got hit by a car, and that feels really scary. So if you can be compassionate with yourself and trace where that emotion's coming back to a little bit, either way, that's super powerful, because then you're validating the emotion.
Well, and also using that with other people too.
Yeah.
Because I don't know about you, but I heard a lot of, you're okay. You're okay. You know,
I'm not okay. Stop telling me.
As a kid, though, you know, that was always the, you know, the feel better is, you're okay, you're fine. Okay, let's stop crying now. You're okay, you're fine, right?
Don't ever say that to a child in front of me.
instead of saying, it sounds like you're having a really hard time. And you know, we can talk about it in the context of speaking to a child, but when you're speaking to yourself, and like you said, showing yourself self-compassion and saying, that was really scary, and it may seem like I should be grateful that I didn't just get hit, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't also scary.
Do not minimize it.
Right.
I think so often we compare our experiences to other people, and go back to the car example. Well, I didn't get hit by the car, but someone else actually did, and it was really bad. So I should just suck it up and be okay.
Comparison.
Absolutely not. Everything you feel, everything you experience is true to you, and you don't need to minimize it. You need to acknowledge it, give yourself self-compassion, and then validate it. Don't minimize it.
Well, and it doesn't mean that you can't also be grateful.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because you can acknowledge that I feel really scared and my adrenaline is surging through my body right now, but I'm also very grateful that that my car wasn't hit. And I think that a lot of times when we start feeling emotions like you were talking about, like, well, someone else actually did get hit, so I should suck it up. We do the at least thing with ourselves, right?
At least this didn't happen.
At least you didn't get hit like this, or at least you aren't gonna be late for work or whatever.
And that is a form of shoving it down.
Right.
That's a form of suppressing it, and it will come out and attack the hell out of you when you least expect it if you don't give it space in the moment. So those are all really good points of how to identify it.
Well, and it's also important to note that it doesn't, again, just because you're acknowledging emotions doesn't mean that you're melodramatic, right? Like, it literally can go just as quick as we just talked through it. Wow, that was really scary. I'm really shaken up. My hands are physically shaking. There's adrenaline in my body. That was really scary. I'm allowed to be scared. I'm really, really grateful that I wasn't hit. And I want to make this a really good day because I feel extremely grateful right now. Move on with your life.
And it's different for everyone. It can go fast for some people. It could be, whew, I'm fine. And then 2 hours later, you start crying or reliving it or being upset. Sure. So knowing that you are you, and however you need to address it and validate it and be present with it, that's totally fine. There's no wrong or right way. So the other context I'm thinking about when being emotionally charged is in relationships. And when I say relationships, I mean your spouse, your partner, your work family, your friendships. When you are emotionally charged, the best thing you can do is give space and time. And sometimes I understand that that's not reasonable, that you might be in a meeting or you might not be able to get away or whatever. But when you can, when you are emotional, again, like Beth Ann said, you are not thinking with your prefrontal cortex. You are responding out of emotion. And to give a little bit more context to the biochemical piece, your brain, when it experiences an event that it has already experienced in a different way. So for example, say I'll use cheating for an example. So if you've been in a relationship and you've been cheated on before, and the patterns and behaviors where they didn't answer your calls when you called them, or they didn't come home when they said they were going to, or there were unexplained purchases, whatever that might have looked like when you are in a similar situation. So say you're in a completely different relationship 10 years down the road and you love that person and you trust them and everything is great. Your brain is trained that when it starts to see those patterns again, it automatically tells your body it's the same experience, whether it is or not. Then when it tells itself the story, it starts releasing the same chemicals that were actually released in your body when it happened the first time. So adrenaline, cortisol. So you will physically feel the feelings of what it felt like the first time you were in that experience, which then what happens? Then you're like, oh my God, I feel this way. It must be true. Like I remember this feeling. And so it's really, and that was huge for me because I rely really heavily on intuition. And so when I would start to get those sensations that I felt in an experience before, I was like, oh my God, it's happening again. And it started this whole spiral. And so it's really important when you're in that moment, if it's a relationship and you're starting to escalate and you start to feel those physiological symptoms, that you give yourself a quick check and say, this is not that situation that happened before. This is not that person. This is what my body is telling me, but it is not the truth. And the more self-talk you can do to kind of bring yourself out of it in the moment, if you can't give space. The first thing is always give space because you don't want to say something you can't take back. But if you can't do that, really self-talk and say, challenge yourself. Like, is that really what's happening? Is that really what's going on? And when you're emotional, you will say and behave in ways that are so far from how you normally are. And it's literally because you're in fight or flight mode. So fight, flight, freeze, fawn, right? Is that the new one?
I don't know what fawn is.
Where you
I heard flock.
Where you cater to someone. So you fawn over them to avoid them being upset with you or hurting you.
Interesting.
Yeah. So when you're in that context of the situation, you literally will behave in a way that is not yourself because you're not yourself in that moment. And what I will say, if you can't do any of the things we just said, follow the golden rule that my mom taught me. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And we've both been in situations where, I mean, I don't know what your thing is. I usually sit on my hands. I try really hard if I feel myself escalating to maintain composure on the outside and give head nods and still be in the moment. And then when it's appropriate, excuse myself. But when you're in those situations, you can't. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all. And whatever you need to do, if you need to pinch your leg under the table or curl your toes, I'm naming things I've done all of these before. To maintain that composure, that's important because the long-term goal at the end of the day is you want to maintain your self-respect and your self-dignity. And when you are in an emotional space, you certainly, maybe you can do it. I could never do it. When I was emotionally charged, I became a different person. And one of the things I so appreciate about my journey of navigating that and kind of getting control of it is that I operate in a way that I have self-respect and integrity and dignity in most of my interactions.
I would say, too, that it's really important that you don't just stay in the place you are now. So for instance, right now, you might not be able to regain your composure when you're in a meeting and something happens and it makes you emotionally charged. Right now, you may not be able to come out of it while you're still in the meeting and be able to participate and give helpful feedback. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't work towards that. Because my typical disposition is so happy and peppy and interactive, if I abide by the golden rule and don't say anything, if I don't have anything nice to say, it becomes very obvious that I've gone quiet.
Yeah.
And it becomes very obvious that my body has shut down from the Tigger-like mode that it's typically in. And it becomes obvious in meetings that I'm having an emotional response. So while I might start off not being able to come out of that while I'm in the meeting, I still work to talk myself through it while it's happening. Like if I can't excuse myself and just have a minute to respectfully go deal with my emotions outside real quick and then come back to the meeting, if I am in the meeting still, I can still talk myself through it and say, there's a way to say what you're feeling in a respectful way.
Yes.
Now, and assume the positive intent on the other side of this argument. We're not on opposite sides of the argument. We're trying to solve the same problem together. So trying to talk yourself through it and give yourself verbal cues that will help you come down from that emotional space. Just because you can't do it right now while you're in the moment doesn't mean that you can't, because you can become a master of your emotions in the moment. And I think that's where healthy discussion can actually happen, because once you get to the point where everyone in the room can control their emotions, then you can have adult conversations and have hard conversations without people having meetings after the meetings or getting really hurt and taking everything personally, which you had listed earlier as something that used to happen for you a lot, is when you were hijacked by those emotions, everything became personal.
Right.
When you take that out of it and you're able to regain composure, then you can have those hard conversations and say, I hear what you're saying. Here's where I'm coming from and where the passion around this topic is coming from me.
Absolutely. And so to segue off of something you just said, let's use the example of taking everything personally. So I used to live in a space where it was not only what people said to me directly, but what I thought they might be saying indirectly, what I thought they were saying with their eyes, with their body language, with the way they looked at me. Hell, sometimes I just made up what they were saying in their head for them because it was easier. And so one of the biggest tools that truly, truly helped me make this shift of getting control over my emotions was a course that I took online, and it was for people who are emotionally sensitive, had experienced trauma, or struggled with BPD, which stands for borderline personality disorder. And so while I don't have that diagnosis, I did fall into the category of being emotionally sensitive. And I remember reading the description, and everything I listed at the beginning of this podcast and then some was there. And I was like, yes, this is what I need to do. So very good course. It actually, I have 2 more months to go. It's a 9-month program.
Yeah, it's pretty intense.
It's a heavy commitment, but that's the level I was at. And some of you might be like, yes, I want to revamp my life. I want this now. And some of you might not be there, or that might not be your style. And you might want smaller incremental things or quick wins, whatever works for you. But the practice they used in this course is dialectical behavioral therapy. And so this is a form of therapy that really works on removing the emotion out of things and getting to what they call your wise mind. So your wise mind is when you're rational, when you're calm, when you know you're in your prefrontal cortex. And the goal is to always get back to your wise mind after the emotional experience and challenge what just happened. So when I used to get upset before, I would tell people, I'd be like, you are being mean. You are pissing me off. What you said was not okay. And it came from a place of passion most times. Sometimes it came from a place of hurt. But I was never taught to give myself time and space in between and then time to challenge it. So what I do now is if I'm feeling really upset about something, I will set a timer, or I will give myself 24 hours to process. And then after that, I will go back and reevaluate the situation and see where it falls. If it still bothers me, I then put a plan together while I'm in my wise mind of how I would choose to handle it while still maintaining my self-respect and dignity. And if it's gone, and the crazy thing, you guys, is sometimes the stuff you are so pissed about, 24 hours later, you're like, oh yeah, not a big deal.
Yeah, not a big deal at all.
Doesn't bother me at all. So the number one goal is to get to your wise mind. And that course has completely undone everything I've behaved as in an emotional state for the past however old I am, years of my life, and rewired new patterns and behaviors. Now, do I always get it right? No, but I would say it's like 85-90% there that I've now rewired my brain of how to navigate short-term shirt storms and long-term shirt storms.
Well, and I think one of the benefits in that class is that it gives us a common language to be able to talk through the situation. So that, and along with some tools, you know, I mentioned Brene Brown ad nauseum, I know, but one of the things she uses, one of the tools she uses is the story I'm telling myself. And so in your course, they've talked about similar ways of, like you said, reflecting on the emotion. Is this true? What are the facts? Take the emotion out of it. You know, is the story I'm telling myself actually what's happening? We do it as a protection mechanism. If we don't know details, if there are unknowns, our minds fill them in. Our minds like a clear-cut good guy, bad guy scenario in our heads. And so that's where when you're talking about checking your emotions, we make up a lot of stories that aren't actually true. And we've talked about it a little bit before on some of the other episodes, but stuff like storytelling, right?
Yeah.
Where we make up what the other person is thinking, feeling, saying, and they're not even doing it.
Yeah.
It's like we're like creating the film in our head, and if you stop, pause, reflect on it, and then take the courageous act of checking that story with them and saying, hey, you seem upset. I might be off on that. Is there anything going on between us? And actually checking that story.
If it's still even relevant.
If it's relevant, right. But when you go through that process, you'll find that sometimes it has nothing to do with you. Right. Sometimes that's like one thing that I found is, when we get really worked up or when we're living in a victim mentality, we're so self-centered. A lot that happens in our world that has nothing to do with us. And yet we take it and we internalize it and we do take it personal. Like you were talking about earlier, we take it personal when there's no need to. It's not about you. And I think there's a quote out on Facebook somewhere that says, people don't think about you nearly as much as you think they do.
Yeah, that's super powerful. And then when we engage in that, we're giving people permission to be inside our heads in a way that probably isn't even true. And even if they are saying those things, you have the choice of whether you give them permission to have space inside your head or not. Now, all of that is coming from almost a year of intensive work with emotions. I know how it feels when you just feel like people are talking about you behind your back or they are thinking things about you. And once you start doing this work, you really start to unpack where it comes from. And I think that will be a different podcast for a different time. But for me, it was all stemming from insecurity. I was telling myself these stories, and it's because I was living in a space of insecurity. And that was the narrative I was telling myself.
Well, and I think that it helps me too to have more compassion in the moment when I realize that most people, when they're acting or behaving in a way that's hurtful to me, to realize that they're behaving out of a place of fear. And then I look at them in a new lens and I say to myself, they're scared. You're the target of what's coming out of their mouths right now, but they're scared. They're protecting themselves and they are fearful that they're going to get hurt.
So now we've talked about how to identify if you're in an emotional shirtstorm, long-term or short-term. We've talked about the signs to look for. We've also talked about things to tell yourself to do, to process right in the moment as it's happening. And so now we're looking at the actual tips and tricks. So those concrete pieces that are going to help you through this. So it might overlap a little bit, but the goal of this last part is how to get you on the other side of it. So when we talk about these tips and tricks, some of them are pretty extreme and pretty intense, and then others are really simple once you wrap your mind around it. So one of the really fun and interesting ones, there's actually two that I learned in this course that I thought were super intense, but it made sense. So the best thing you can do when you need to snap yourself out of something emotional quickly is dunk your face in a bowl of ice water.
What?
And the reason that is because when you put your face in ice water, it triggers.
It twiggles.
It triggers the mammalian response that you're drowning. And so because your face...
This is like self-torture.
It is a little bit, but it's kind of brilliant. So your face going into ice cold water tricks your body into thinking that you're drowning under ice cold water, and you snap out of it to get back to reality instead of living in an emotional space. So I've not tried that one, but I know they also say you can grab an ice cube like out of the freezer and just hold it in your hand. And that
I'm more likely to do that one.
That will trick your brain into just distracting it. So cognitive shift, anything that's a hard cognitive shift. So these are for like extreme situations. The other thing you can do is bite a lemon or something really sour, really tart. Again, it triggers your brain out of that emotional space. It's a hard cognitive shift and it brings you back to reality. A more grounding technique is grounding. So that's a bit longer of a process, and you guys can look that up online. I won't get into it too much, but basically it's taking what's already in your environment around you and identifying it to bring yourself back out of that emotional space, back to your prefrontal cortex. So I have used that a couple of times. It took some practice. I was not good at it at first. I would just be like,
yeah, you don't like when I use that one on you.
Yeah.
When you're having a tough time with anxiety.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what do you see? And you're like, stop making me ground.
It's bad when I give you the tools and then you use them on me. So those were some of the more extreme techniques. But the most powerful one I learned that really, really helped me, especially in those times I was feeling very intense emotions, tell yourself, no emotion lasts forever.
That's one of my favorite tools you use.
It is scientifically proven it is not possible for an emotion to last forever. And so when you're in the depths of whatever you're in, whether you're crying, you're having a panic attack, you're depressed, whatever that is, telling yourself no emotion lasts forever gives you the light at the end of the tunnel. And really for me, that's the first stage. Like when I'm feeling super sad, I am like, okay, this sucks right now and it's hard, but no emotion lasts forever. And I know that there's a better feeling on the other side of this. So that is super powerful. The other thing that was really helpful to me when I was feeling that my emotions were kind of going on or spiraling or cycling, which does happen sometimes, especially if you're in grief, which you do need to let the grief cycle happen. But there's also a way to put a boundary on it. And I know that sounds a little heartless, but I'm just sharing what works best for me. And for me, if I find myself cycling or a prolonged crying episode, I say, okay, you have an hour to cry, to be pissed, to do whatever you need to do to get it out. And after that, you're going to have a step in a different direction, whether that's you're going to get up off of the couch and go outside for a walk, or you're going to call a friend. Like, this is your time limit. And sometimes for the bigger stuff, it might be days. Like, I'm going to give myself the weekend to process this, and then I need a plan to move in the right direction. And even if your next step is just making a plan, that's okay too. There are lots of tips and tricks that can help in these situations. And for me, what helped me navigate out of that emotional space that I was living in and helped me take control back was a combination of all of them at different times. So sometimes one thing would work, other times something else would. So really, it just depends on what is most helpful to you. But I will close with this because I feel like in any situation where emotions are involved, you need to have your corner people. You need to have your people that you trust, that you know have your back, that you can reach out to them and say, I'm having a really hard time, and this is what just happened. And especially if you're setting boundaries or you know something emotional is coming, like if you have an animal that's about to pass away or you're changing houses, that's a big change in your life that might trigger some grief and emotion, or you're enforcing a boundary. You get as proactive as you can. You reach out to those people and you say, this is what's happening. I feel okay right now, but I know at some point this is going to happen. And if you can even get a step further and arm them with the tools that will be helpful to you, like if you could do a little research about some of these things we talked about and then give them those, that is super helpful.
Well, and they also have to be people who are willing to call you on your shirt.
Yes.
Like
yeah.
they have
in
to
a
be
loving way.
In a loving way, of course, but that's why they're your corner people, because someone who cares about you and loves you is not going to heartlessly call you on your stuff.
Right.
But it's very important that they feel comfortable doing it and that you give them the permission to do that, because if not, then all they are yes people. And
True.
we don't need yes people in our corner. We need people who are going to say, hey, you're not acting in alignment with your top values right now. Hey, I think that you might be spiraling right now. How can I help you ground? Hey, this is what I'm seeing happening. Talk me through what's happening on your end. They have to be people who are strong enough and willing to call you on your stuff so that they don't let you go down that road of being emotionally unregulated.
Yeah, I'm thinking of my buddy Drew right now.
Drew's so good at it.
Drew is one of my corner people, and we both are very well versed in processing and emotions and all of that good stuff. And so I'll be proactive and say, hey, this is what's going on, like, just so you know. And expecting like he'll be empathetic, which he always is, but then there's the kicker that comes behind. And we do that for each other. Like it's that timeline. Like there's a time to grieve it and be empathetic and compassionate and like let it happen. But then there's also the next step piece where it's like, okay, you said you were going to do this and now you haven't. So what's this plan? In the moment, if someone comes to you and they're like, hey, this is going on, I'm having a hard time, just listen.
Yeah.
Just listen and say that must be really tough, because a lot of times people just need someone to talk to.
Speaking of emotions, we're happy that you spent some time with us today.
Oh, I see what you did
See,
there.
emotions. I'm identifying that I'm happy.
Oh my gosh.
So once again, thanks for taking some time to spend with us today. We always love hanging out with you. And now we want to hear your feedback on the topic. We want to hear about your experiences. We want to know what you took away from this episode. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to direct message us on social media at Life with Beth and Court on Facebook and Instagram. And we would love it if you'd drop us a note over on the show notes at lifewithbethandcourt.com. And if you're feeling it, leave us a review on iTunes and let people know what you dig about the show. That helps other people discover our show and find all the good stuff. So until next time, my friends, keep building your best life.
Bye, guys.
What is our mic check today?
Well, since last week it was Whitney, this week it's also Whitney. I probably should have made it a challenge to always mic check with Whitney. Any guesses?
That sounds really intense to try to mic check as Whitney.
Not as Whitney. I will be myself singing Whitney.
Big shoes to fill.
You should know the song for what we're talking about. In fact, you should do the mic check.
What are we talking about?
Emotions. I get so emotional, baby. Ain't it shocking what love? Oh, that was real bad. Damn it. Love. I just sound like a Wookiee.
You really do.
That was Beth, not me.
That's Court with the growl.
Sounds like, why can't you do it? Oh, I got nervous. I have podcast performance anxiety. It's really hard to master the Whitney growl. I've been trying since I was 3.
Well, yep. She's one of the greatest singers of all time, so kind of hard to master
hurts my
anything.
feelings.
I said one of.
Speaking of feelings and emotions, that was hurtful.
Can't laugh.
Can't help it. Okay, 3, 2, 1, focus. I hate it.
Did you just try to wink at me?
I did. Did both eyes close?
No,
Then
it
how'd
looked like
you know it wasn't a
seizure.
Usually when I try to wink, both eyes closed. So to avoid that, I have to do this with my mouth. It's like a wind up. And then I'm still not sure what happened.
No, it wasn't a wink. It was like you shuddered because a butterfly flew it dry.
I have had a twitch in my left eye the past couple of weeks.
We named this podcast after kind of a what? 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 Literally, we're never going to get this recorded. What do you mean you don't know what's happening?
You just start talking. I can't laugh. Okay. 3, 2, 1, focus.
Are you saying that to me or you?
Both, but to me. Okay, go.
Do you know what we're talking about today?
Yeah, I'll just close my eyes and not look at you. It's fine.
So looking at me made you laugh?
Yes. Do you want me to do it?
No! Maybe.